So today, let's talk about the not so good side of ham radio. And that is some, not all, some of the people. A lot of times they are labeled as LIDS, and you may see that in training material, or you may have heard reference to that before. To be honest, I'm not quite sure where the reference came from. Someone could probably give a history lesson on that. But we call them LIDS, and generally the best thing to do with LIDS is to ignore them. Much like bullies, just kind of ignore them. So, but let's talk more in depth on that. There are multiple kinds, multiple things that happen, and just kind of how to deal with them, at least somewhat. So let's start with your local repeaters and stuff. Sometimes the LIDS will be just someone who keys down at the same time you are and mutes you. Or they just might sit there, tapping, keying the repeater, or doing lots of things that just in general cause chaos to the general populace. Sometimes you can't ignore them because it's causing actual problems. For one time we were getting ready to do a weather net, and someone keyed down on the guy who's helping us coordinate to figure out where we were going and how we were going to approach it. Not cool at all. They were doing the similar thing during our nets. Okay, fine, it's not technically emergency, ignore them, maybe they go away, except they never did. I think they finally figured out who it was, and I think they had a conversation. So sometimes that ends up being what it is, and in this case, it was a radio club that had the conversation with them, or radio club leadership. And sometimes that's the approach you have to take. On HF, things get interesting because it likely is not the person next door or the person down the road. It could be someone on the other side of the country that's doing this to you. And there are many, 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 many different forms of LIDS on HF. So some will just run a tuner right on top of you. Sometimes it's just because of propagation. Admittedly, they can't hear you, but you can hear them. A lot of times it tends to, and probably about 50% of the time, let's just say, it tends to be intentional. Maybe or on their frequency, or unknown many other things. So there's not much you can do about that. You just kind of work around them. DNF, is it? I think they're on the Yaesu radios, at least. I think it's a DNF button. I push that. It kind of drowns out the piercing part of the tuner, so it doesn't kill my ears. But I can. It's still, depending on how strong it is, could drown out who I'm making the contact with or who I'm talking to. But then there's others who will play music on HF. A, against FCC rules. B, they are very intentionally doing this. And C, sometimes they just don't go away. And what you'll learn with some of these people is they just hold their grudges, much like in real life relationships. They just hold this grudge, and no matter how silly it is, no matter how crazy they're driving you, they keep doing it because they're getting some sort of pure pleasure out of this. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do. You can try to track them down. But if you don't have enough people around to try and help triangulate them, it's really hard to find them. So sometimes you either just have to move, have a secret code for how to move, or do kind of things like that. And then there's a fourth, I'm not sure what number I'm on. Anyway, there's one other kind that I like to point out, and this can get interesting. So I've mentioned before, we run nets, OMS, and our center frequency is 3.825. all on 80 meters, and all of our net controls are taught that that is not our frequency. We move up and down the frequency 10 kilohertz to find an open frequency. Oh, excuse me. And that is what we use. If there's nothing open in that 20 kilohertz range, we don't run that, period. And we have had that scenario before. However, you're running the net, you're halfway through, you've ran the list, you've been on this frequency for an hour, and all of a sudden someone just starts talking right over you. You're on their frequency. They've always used it for the last 100 years, and we've never moved. This is our frequency. Well, first of all, according to the FCC, no one owns any given frequency. The only frequencies that are reserved are through gentleman agreements. So, Hurricane WatchNet, they have two given frequencies. It is generally understood if you are if there is a Hurricane WatchNet running, you just avoid those frequencies because it's a well-known list and it helps everyone coordinate its emergency services. Yes. There's another couple of them. One is monitoring ocean something or other, maritime net, I think it is, which again, arguably, it's for emergency services. I don't know how much they actually do for emergency, but that's another one to avoid. So there are some given ones that through gentlemen's agreements, everyone agrees we just avoid. But anything else is open game. Technically first come, first serve. But these people, I'll avoid any labeling, but you probably guess, come in, they don't care if you're a kilohertz up, 2 kilohertz up, they have their 1.5 kilowatt amp, they turn it up to full, and they just start talking. In fact, a lot of times, you don't even hear like, hey, you there? They just start talking right over the top of you. And sometimes it's what we call propagation. Propagation, I can hear you just fine, you can't hear me, or I can hear John, but I can't hear you. And sometimes it's just an innocent mistake. And you should always talk to them and say, hey, you're on top of our net. We've been here for the last hour. Can you please move? You should always try that because that is a gentleman way to do things. That's what gets you by on the net. And lady, like whatever, that's just called gentleman agreements normally. These people will say, nope, I've been here for X number of years. You're on top of my frequency. You have to move. I'm sorry, blah, 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 blah. And, they will shut you down, or sometimes they just completely ignore you. You have two options. One, they jumped on your frequency. You hold that frequency and continue running. Arguably, that gets very difficult sometimes. Or B, you just say, screw it, we're moving. Can we find a new frequency? And let's coordinate there. Unfortunately, that is the way things work. And there are assholes out on the air that don't give a crap. So you just have to deal with them because the FCC does minimal patrolling at this point. So it's really on us to sign a self-patrol and just kind of work it amongst ourselves. And sometimes the best course of action is to just move or just turn off the radio. So there's some information about LIDS. They are very common, unfortunately, especially in HF. That is one of your worst experiences that you'll have on HF. But I promise you there's a whole lot more great people out there than there are bad. So 7-3 is from WX0MIK.